In 1984, Robert Sandifer, at the age of 11 years old, murdered a neighboring girl just to he himself be murdered by 13-year-old Derek Hardaway. It's things like this that allow us to ask ourselves what the juvenile justice system is doing to help control or reduce the crime and incarceration rates of youth in the U.S. over time. Now, today we're going to be learning about the effectiveness of the juvenile justice system. I myself have not been incarcerated or detained more than a couple hours in my lifetime, so I'm simply offering the facts that I found through a non-biased search. My thesis is that the fluctuation in crime rates from 1970 to 2019 is a direct reflection of the tumultuous effectiveness of the juvenile justice system for the past 50 years. Today, we're going to specifically be looking at the increase in crime from 1970 to the 1990s, which reached its climax in the mid-1990s and had then made steep decline into our modern society today. So first, I'd like to talk about how the increase in crime started in 1970 to 1990, right? And according to Lipton, Marsden, and Wilkes report in 1975, with few and isolated exceptions, the rehabilitative efforts that have been reported so far have no appreciative effort on recidivism. And what recidivism is repeating the same behavior that once led to negative consequences. So what is being said is that the rehabilitative services during this time did not produce much change in the juveniles, leading to higher incarceration rates. This conclusion was reached through an examination of 231 studies on rehab facilities in the United States. All this information was found in a scholarly article written by Dan McAleer from the Youth and Society Journal in 1993. Now, another reason why the increase in crime occurred was because the focus of the system also shifted from rehabilitation to a justice model. And what a justice model is the process that a criminal has to go through for prosecution or trial. So focusing on the justice model is simply focusing on the process. Now, according to Castellano from the Law and Policy Journal written in 1986, the 1977 justice law's concentration was changing sentence structures, giving rise to juveniles, and punishment instead of rehabilitation. Now, Castellano shows us that the juvenile justice model resulted in a rise in juvenile crime that was unforeseen and unpredicted. So seeing how the youth crime skyrocketed could only lead us to assume that there had to have been a climax at some point. So to continue on, the increase in crime led to the highest amount of convictions in the 1900s. So from 1994 to 1995, the crime rates reached their peaks. In 1995, there was about 381,000 youth in confinement in 1 year, and in one single day, there was about 107,000 in confinement, according to the Annie Casey Foundation. Now, at this point, youth were outscaling adults in crime. According to the Retro Report, or Combating the Myth of the Super Predator, during this time, youth were committing double the amount of homicide as adults. And John J. DeFulio predicted that the crime rate for youth would quadruple from its peak in 1995, which led the entire nation to focus on funding reformation for legislation in the juvenile justice system. Let's take a look at how this collective effort to reduce juvenile crime resulted in the next coming years. To the surprise of many, our current juvenile crime rate has statistically plummeted. The entire country agreed to aid the increase in accountability for youth prosecution. Myers from the Criminal Justice Policy Review says that the JAIBG Act of the Juvenile Incentive Block Grants Act in 1977 focused on things like subjecting serious and violent juvenile offenders to adult prosecution, establishing appropriate drug testing policies and procedures, and improving juvenile record-keeping systems to parallel those for adult offenders. This led to $685 million being granted to the juvenile justice system from 1998 to 2000. Fortunately, youth incarceration rates have decreased in most states now. In 2013, most states dropped from 10 to 40+%, according to the Annie Casey Foundation. In 2019, there are now only about 48,000 youth held in facilities, according to Wendy Sawyer from the Prison Policy Initiative in 2019. Excitingly, we see now the great progress in the effectiveness of our juvenile justice system. But how has the system treated our youth overall for the past 50 years? In conclusion, we can see that the trend is that there is no trend. And this essentially reflects the effectiveness of our juvenile justice system. Right? And we saw that it started with an increase in the 1970s, which then reached its climax in 1994 and 1995, and has now dropped to roughly 48,000 that are now confined in our modern society year round. I believe it is important to recognize how effectively our justice system has helped and is helping those who may not have had the same opportunities as we did, right? And ultimately, the help that incarcerated youth around us receive is something we shouldn't overlook. We shouldn't forget about those who have been forced to live in a state of quarantine for years, because we ourselves are going to get out of our state of quarantine much sooner than they are. Thank you.